They handed me the ledger on a Tuesday that smelled of rain and old wax, a small book that should have fit a pocket and instead felt like something you could be indicted with. The man who introduced me to the last judgment unit had fingers like folded paper. He did not smile. He said only, "Observe. Do not translate. Rule IX." I mouthed the Latin because words rearrange fear into procedure. Non-ledger, non-recensor, because saying a rule aloud makes it sound less like a threat and more like a contract. I had been eager. I had polished brass plaques and learned catalogue codes, convinced that clerical life could be orderly even when it trafficked in mysteries. That confidence vanished the first time I laid the ledger flat and felt a vibration as if the book breathed. At first I treated it like an artifact. I cross-referenced the names with registers and transfer slips because that is the work I was trained to do. An archivist believes truth will appear in footnotes and that tidy records are the remedy to rumor. The ledger obliges. Its marginalia offers dates and feast days, abbreviations that look like the old chancellor's hand. The handwriting in the margins is older than the chapel. It curls and corrodes the paper, a script that seems to spread overnight along the edges like mildew. For a few nights, I convinced myself the humming at Vespers was the building settling, that the way the page warmed under my palm was the lamp's proximity. I should have stopped there, when ordinary explanations still lay thin and plausible. But the book learns to use you. Names appear that match the small-town parishes of my childhood, the bell-ringer who loaned me coins, the curate who taught catechism, the old woman who kept the candles, and each name arrives with a margin note that reads less like biography and more like instruction. Columns labeled NOMINA, TINSFER, EXECUTIO read like indexes until you realize verbs are not descriptions, they are directives. One column lists terse commands, TINSFER, IDDITIO, EXSILIM, and there is a cruelty in how precise the ledger's language is, as if it were an office memo rather than a sentence on a soul. Once patterns suggest themselves, the chapel's geometry rearranges itself to fit them. The ledger pairs feast days with entries, aligns anniversaries to transfers. It does not shout about its mechanism, it footnotes the world into compliance. At night, the hymn will pass through the nave, and the paper will answer in a rustle that matches cadence, as if the ink listens. I started keeping a separate sheet of notes, dates, references, and tried to map what felt like an engine hidden beneath vellum. The mapping made it worse. Where I saw logic, the ledger offered choreography, a ledger that sets things in motion by namming them. It is tempting to call it malevolent and be done. It is more accurate to call it administrative. The ledger accomplishes its taking with stamps and rubrics. It is the formal economy of possession. Men with clean collars will tell you the thing is legal in form because language hides power. My colleagues whisper Latin over those pages and then wash their hands of it, polishing brass until letters shine like teeth. They use phrases that sound like theology but act like policy. Quem liberat, quem vincit. They tidy notes, make the sign of three, and speak as if the right is just that, right, until you realize they are apologizing to the ledger by habit. Reading changes you in ways books ought not to. You begin to notice small betrayals. A candle gutters when you linger on a line, footsteps outside the vestry that mimic your breath, the organ's shifting key as if to underline a clause. You dream in Latin and wake with the taste of incense on your tongue. People in the refectory ask how the cataloguing goes, and I tell them I index relics. They nod and return to their soup, because what I do reads like method, not omen. I fold the ledger beneath my cassock like contraband. It is heavy and warm, and somehow fits into the curve of my ribs, as if it were waiting for a heartbeat to learn. There is a bureaucratic cruelty to the ledger, because bureaucracy is patient and precise. It does not force with thunder, it takes by annotation. A transfer stamped into a file becomes an itinerary for an erasure you cannot see until it is completed. Once I watched a clerk stamp EXECUTED and felt the paper recoil as if a cord had been severed inside the book. Once I found a folded prayer in my pocket that I did not write, the ink cramped and decisive, my initials in a margin I do not remember signing. I should have stopped when the confessional answered me back in my father's cadence. when I found a name that I had never spoken, not even to myself. I tried the petty resistances of an archivist, covering a page with wax, slipping a folio into another, leaving the ledger in the vault overnight. Resistance felt theatrical when the mechanism is quiet and patient. The ledger replies by rearranging its references elsewhere. A transfer appears in a register you thought safe. A signature surfaces in ink where there had been none. It is precise work, an economy that balances itself with the exactitude of an audit. There is, beneath the clerical language, a sanctity of calculation that makes the ledger more terrifying than any shout. Now my attention is divided. By day I catalogue, I polish, I answer to superiors in measured Latin and make the unit appear reasonable. By night I read until my hands ache and the page edges make grooves in my palms. Habit gives me comfort. I whisper the rule to myself as if repetition could become resistance. Non-ledger, non-recensor. But habit is not the same as will. Every action seems annotated in a book I did not write. Every hesitation recorded, as if the ledger were conducting its own audit of conscience. There are small things that now read like evidence. A whisper beneath the choir stalls that answers a prayer before it leaves my mouth. The way a candle gutters when I run my finger down a certain column. The clerk who avoids my eyes after finding a name scrubbed from a brass plate. I should have stopped when the confessional answered me back in my father's cadence, and the folded prayer I found in my pocket had my handwriting on its margin. But I told myself those were coincidences, the mind's habit of patterning. I told myself I was an archivist, not an accuser. Yet the ledger will not be flattened into categories. It spreads like a stain, implicating memory, ritual, and the small choices I thought private, until privacy itself becomes an office record. I should have stopped when the sound aligned with my heartbeat. Yet I kept reading, and now I wait for the knock that is not an archivist's. When it comes, I will have no words to refuse paper. I repeat Rule 9 to myself like a rosary: non-ledger, non-recensor. The phrase becomes both talisman and accusation, something I press into the hollow of my palm when the ledger's leather seems to hum with a life that is not mine. The senior archivist struck the oak table when he pronounced it. The sound landed on me like a sentence. He set the ledger down as if it were a thing that might bite and walked away, leaving me with the impression that the book had been entrusted to me by mistake and that mistakes in our unit have an appetite. Newcomers often believe that procedure is protection. I believed it too, until procedure started reading me back. For the first month, I performed the clerical rituals with a kind of mechanical devotion. I learned the codes and the shorthand: NOMINA, TINSFER, EXECUTIO. I file, I cross-reference, I stamp. It is the part of the job that smells of soap and order, the part that makes the unit look like any other bureaucratic office. But the ledger resists being catalogued as if it were a stubborn artifact instead of an instrument. Marginalia shifts when you look away, dates wobble into verbs. A feast day becomes an injunction. I put anomalies into a folder labeled ANOMALIA and think of myself as a cautious scholar. That self-image is an illusion that the ledger quickly corrects. There is, perversely, a kind of comfort in method. An archivist believes in systems. Mapping a pattern feels like mastery. So when small deviations appear, an extra rubric here, an interlinear note there, I trace them. I draw arrows between entries and set them into matrices on scrap paper. I chart the recurrences as though drawing constellations over a sky that refuses to be random. The ledger tolerates my mapping, and in a way that makes me ashamed, seems to appreciate it. Names that should be inert register like commands. A column labeled TINSFER does not simply record movement, it prescribes it. A neat stamp will translate into action in the world in a manner that is almost administrative in its cruelty. The first time the ledger singled someone I knew, I want to tell you I fled. Instead, I did the work I was trained to do. A transfer request materializes in a ledger I maintain. A small rectangle of paper, the unit's seal, a name. The hand on the form is mine, not so much mine as an approximation of it, cleaner, the letters too exact, as if someone had practiced my signature in a quieter room. The clerk who submitted it acts surprised when I ask. He insists no one signed the form. He insists no one requested the transfer. Yet the stamp reads clear, EXECUTIO. The joiner's son from a village I once visited in my childhood catalogue is marked with an efficiency that makes my throat taste of iron. That night, the chapel holds his cap on its peg, and nothing else. The ledger's logic is patient and petty. People in cassocks move through its mechanisms with the bland, practiced dexterity of accountants. They polish brass nameplates with the dedication of penitents, and each sharpened letter seems to make a seam in a world I had assumed was continuous. Make transitions cleaner, a senior archivist says once, as if sanctity can be improved by shine. Their language reduces grief to terms. Renditio, exilium, vacatio. They speak as if applying jurisprudence to persons, and in that speech, the human is flattened into a file. Watching them manage names like inventory is the part of my job that has made me distrust tidy sentences. When I try small acts of refusal, the ledger replies with the benign cruelty of a system that has been running long enough to absorb idiosyncrasy. I slip a page into a sealed box. I cover a marginal note with wax. I misfile a folio in the hopes that misplacement will cause the machine to miss a beat. The ledger does not miss beats. Instead, an editorial hand appears, older than any of us, and inserts a rubric. One letter, R, in red ink, a marker that turns omission into mandate. I dream in forms. I wake with the impression of seals on my tongue and the unwelcome knowledge that to hesitate is to be recorded. It is an odd kind of terror that comes from realization rather than threat. The ledger is not a thunderous demon so much as a sober clerk with an appetite for completion. The horrors it enacts are precise. When a transfer aligns with a specific feast, the pattern snaps into place and the world outside conforms. A man once listed opposite a particular saint's day was not found the next morning. The parish reported him absent, and then not at all. The officiant murmured the Latin terms as if reciting municipal law. There is a polish to cruelty here. Everything is done cleanly, with receipts. My sense of agency narrows to an index finger that traces the ledger's columns. I tell myself mapping is resistance, that if I can discern the logic, I can anticipate it and perhaps undo it. But description is not always intervention. Often it is calculation. I keep tally. I annotate shifts and record correlatives between entries that, I tell myself, must be errors. I catalogue anomalies as if the act of knotting them enfeebles them. That is the lie I live by in daylight. At night the ledger's hum thickens, and my notes feel like confessions I am forced to deliver, not evidence I can use. I should have stopped the night the archivist slammed his palm on the table and pronounced Rule 9 like a burial. I did not. I kept tracing names, mapping the exceptions into a logic of my own making, a logic that makes me complicit. Each catalogued anomaly becomes a finger I can point to, and each pointed finger becomes another stitch in the ledger's network. The lock that Rule 9 was supposed to be has a key I did not see myself pocketing: curiosity. If Rule 9 is a lock, then curiosity is a poor locksmith, capable of opening doors but unable to bear what stands beyond. There is a key in my pocket. I do not know who left it there, only that my hand finds it by habit. Soon. They gave me the confessional keys, as if passing on something alive. Heavy brass on a loop that sat like a weight against my palm and made me aware of the room before I even crossed its threshold. The confessional is not used for parish penance in our unit. It is a container for forensic depositions, a curtained vault where statements are recorded when speech must be kept from the public ear. When they asked me to sit in it for procedure, an observational task, they said, as ordinary as checking a log. I agreed because work has its own inertia, and because the unit likes people who will do the small tasks without comment. I take the rosary from my pocket without thinking. Motion is habit, a kind of armor. I count the beads the way one counts a metronome. 1 Our Father, 3 Hail Marys, a pause, the creed in a whisper I do not intend to finish. At first the stall settles into the ordinary hush of wood and dust. The curtain is a forgiving darkness. Then a sound answers me, not an echo but a voice that slides into the cadence of my prayer and finishes the bead, counts the way, a choir completes an unfinished phrase. I try to rationalize, but the voice does more than mimic. When I stumble over ablative or genitive, it supplies the proper case, as if correcting a novice with patience. When I murmur the name of a narrow lane from my childhood, it answers with the name of a woman who used to kneel there and light candles, as if someone in the wood had been watching and taking notes. Its knowledge is not encyclopedic, but personal. It pronounces saints' names with a warmth reserved for those who have learned them by heart, and it answers private things with the quiet certainty of a confessor who has been reading long after night. After I leave the curtain, the air clings to my cassock with a smell I cannot file under incense alone. Sulphur braided with warm candle wax, an oiliness that feels wrong in a place meant to sanctify breath. In my pocket, there is a folded scrap of paper I did not remember taking. I unfold it with reluctance and hunger. On the scrap is a short prayer, clipped Latin like a margin note from an ancient missal, and beneath the prayer a name written in a hand that makes my stomach pinch with recognition and dread. I could have stopped, set the scrap on the altar and refused the keys, but curiosity and procedure wear the same habit, and I returned under the pretense of a second observation. The second time the voice is less patient. It cuts between beads with fragments, memories I never uttered, private mistakes, and petty cruelties I had stored like paperbacks in a closet. It does not accuse directly, but insinuates. A recollection here, a prompted shame there, insinuations folded into liturgical cadence so that the ritual itself becomes an interrogation. Procedural oddities unsettle me. There are no vents that should carry a voice from the sacristy to my stall, yet the voice names vestry keys, the precise number of candles set for a particular mass, initials used decades ago to sign a transfer. Its answers are elliptical, shaped like hymn refrains, implication dressed as praise. Indirection becomes its tool, suggestion is its sacrament. I experiment, thinking method will protect me. I say names that appear only in our margins, hamlets and chapel dedications that the ledger keeps in a faint hand, and the voice answers with dates and verbs. Revenit, reversio, redire. Once I said the name of a county, and it paused to intone a sequence of months that meant nothing to me then, but felt like a clock winding, like a bell being set for a toll. I begin to map patterns in the way I map anomalies in a file. Habit pushes me to catalogue, to index, to draw arrows between entries until the paper looks like constellations. Mapping gives a sick consolation. If I can discern the grammar of the voice, perhaps I can anticipate it, perhaps I can refuse the ledger's appetite. But method is not immunity. The confessional begins to leave receipts. A folded prayer with a name appears in my pocket. A phrase I did not write appears in a margin. A memory I had not meant to confess is patiently returned to me, as if someone had annotated my life. There is a bureaucratic cruelty here, an efficiency to the taking that makes me sick. The voice uses liturgical terms as ledger entries, and the chapel's rituals become paperwork. Where liturgy and ledger meet, the custodian becomes the questioned. Ritual becomes a registry, and mercy sounds like a stamp. I tell myself I am merely recording, that mapping its grammar will expose an error, that exposure equals remedy. I tell myself things to stay sane in daylight. At night, the voice's soft intrusions take on a different tone. They feel like directions more than revelations, like instructions disguised in hymn. I have seen clerks here who prefer to polish brass until letters shine, men who speak of renditio and vacatio as if they were policies rather than sentences about persons. They smooth a nameplate, and in the same motion smooth the seam between living and erasure. I should have stopped when the confessional first finished my counts. I should have refused the keys, left the scrap on the altar, and never returned. I did not. The folded scrap bore a name I could place, a face from a childhood parish, a woman who once tied our hymnals with string. When the scrap turned up, I understood that the confessional had been listening and writing at once, that it used the measure of my beads as ledger entries, and left me with the proof. I do not know whether the name it inscribed was mercy or indictment. To be read to in a holy place is not always kindness. I should have stopped, and I say that now because memory is one of the few pieces of paper the ledger has not yet taken from me. But I did not stop, because curiosity and the pretense of duty are twin sins in this house. And in the curtain dark, with beads under my thumb and a voice that knew my father's name, I learned that questions can sound like absolution, and that the thing that hears you might already have written your answer in ink. I should have closed the curtain and walked away, but I did not, and now I carry a written name like a summons I cannot fold away. Midnight in the vestry tastes like brass and lemon oil. The lamps are low and the world outside the stone is a held breath. Vestry has a function in most churches. Vestments, repairs, the quiet work that keeps the altar presentable. But our vestry's work is more particular. We polish names. I learned that on my third week when a senior registrar led me down the corridor with a lantern and a cloth and set a brass plaque into my hands as if it were a relic. The plaque's letters were raised and tired. When I rubbed at them, the dust fell away in small, obedient flakes. That first night the men worked in a silence threaded with ritual. Cloths brushed brass, the occasional low murmur, a scrape of a rag against a raised serif. The registrar explained the procedure as if reading from a dry manual. Polish until the letters catch light. Present them for inspection. Sign the nightly docket. He did not look like a man speaking about a tool. He looked like a man who had been given the authority to make certain things legible. They say polishing is mercy. They say it makes judgment easier. When you shine a nameplate, the letters catch the lamp and become legible in a way that memory is not. The polished brass refuses dust as if by will. The registry men speak of smoother transitions and cleaned precedents, as if finishing a letter can make a soul's passage less jagged. The language is administrative and absolute, the kind that baptizes policy. They hand you a name and a rag and tell you the hour, midnight, when the house is quiet and names settle into themselves. The idea is that tidy letters move tidy things and that tidy things are easier to account for. It comforts them, it comforts me, until the plaque begins to answer. It is difficult to make the sensation sound like anything other than superstition, but the first name I polished seemed to push back against the cloth. I expected dull metal. Instead, the letters warmed under my palm, and a small vibration ran through the plaque, like a pulse. The senior registrar watched with the composure of a man who has learned to watch edges be shaved for years. "Let it speak," he said, and I realized the word was literal. Names responded, some with a little tremor, some with nothing at all, and when they responded the men nodded in a way that looked almost like prayer. I wanted to laugh at myself afterward for being surprised. They were not surprised at all. They treat these things as instruments, not miracles. Each plaque's life is peculiar. Some hum faintly, like bees behind glass, and others are stubborn, stone cold, set aside to be hidden rather than polished. Hidden plaques are kept behind extra varnish or stacked in unmarked boxes. I asked once why some letters would not shine, and they called it resistance, as if a name's reluctance were a quirk. "Some things are not to be eased," the registrar said, tending to his cloth with a ritual neatness that made the motion almost liturgical. There are rules about hiding as there are rules about namming. Both act in the same bureaucratic voice. A plaque that refuses the rag is not sent for polishing again. It is catalogued as reserved and sequestered. Those names are, in practice, quarantined. The work develops a domestic cruelty. You become intimate with other people's syllables, first names, family modifiers, the small apostrophes that carry a life, and you begin to place them. A name might belong to the baker on Via Santo, another to a widow I once saw at Vespers. When you polish a name, you are not merely cleaning brass. You are preparing an index card in a larger file. Men in the vestry swap notes in whispers, quiet for the DeLuca plate, mark for transition, and the phrases make the air thin. I learned to recognize the cadence of certain surnames and to feel a small, private shame when a name I polished belonged to someone whose face I could place at Christmas Mass. It feels shockingly personal to make someone legible. It is naive to think ignorance grants innocence. When the registrar set a plaque with my childhood street on it into my hands, the idea that I could escape knowledge evaporated. I wanted to turn away. I wanted the night to continue without me, but my hands have learned the ritual. The cloth slides, and the letters begin to shine like white-lipped teeth. As the street's name brightens, I feel the world rearrange itself, as if a map I did not know I carried is being corrected. I set the plaque down because procedure says to set it down, because the men nod when it passes inspection, and because refusal is a thing our unit does not reward. Later, when I stand alone in the corridor, I feel the plaque's softened light on the back of my hand like a summons. Other men avoid certain plaques. There are names no one volunteers for. They are older and small, as if written in a hand that predates mercy. We keep them in a locked crate, labeled with a Roman numeral and a private hand. The crate sits in the corner and smells faintly of cedar and wax. And once, at the edge of night, I found a junior clerk kneeling by it, his hands trembling as if he'd been given a sacrament that named his fault. "Hidden names," he murmured when he saw me, then shut the crate as if a glance might let light in where there should be none. The crate has its own hush. We have an economy of nomenclature, a taxonomy of who can be named and how loudly. Those who are polished move toward transition, those varnished move toward a different fate. The men here developed superstitions that coexist with policy. They time their polishing to liturgical hours, believing the alignment improves outcomes. They bring talismans, a rosary wrapped around a wrist, a prayer murmured under breath for tempering. It is a strange decorum built on procedure. The registrar speaks of precedents as if they were weather, patterns to be read and respected. And in this language, cruelty becomes precedent. At times I watch the registrar's hands and wonder where the authority comes from. Who decided which names are polished and which varnished? Is there a manual thicker than any ledger, a circled paragraph that allows some names to be cleared and others to be obscured? Questions are dangerous because in our unit they are treated like drafts, filed away or redacted. When I ask, "Who chooses?" the registrar smiles with a fatigue that is almost affection and says, "History chooses." It is an answer that conceals as much as it reveals, and I find the consolation of mystery thinner than I thought. I began keeping a ledger of the vestry itself, how many plates were polished each night, the intervals between transitions, and how a name's sheen seemed to correspond to a blank in the parish roll. The registrar watches such numbers with a quiet curiosity. He asks questions that are probes for pattern. Once he asked whether I had ever left coins beneath a bench for a stranger, and when I said yes, his face softened as if the datum pleased him. There is a logic here that rewards certain small mercies, and in that logic kindness becomes currency. He told me, in that pleasant tone they use for administrative decisions, that those who have given outwardly small gifts are easier to shift. The ledger finds it polite to receive them. I tell this not to indict him. He is a careful man who will bring you broth when your watch runs thin, but to show how intimacy and erasure can coexist. The more tender the handling, the cleaner the excision. I should have refused my street when it was first placed before me. I should have let dust reclaim its letters. Instead, I polished, and by the time I set the plaque down, a small order had been completed and another quietly set in motion. The men cross themselves and rearrange names like tidy accounts, and in their ordinary care, the machinery of removal becomes respectable. That is what terrifies me. Not a scream, but the domestic softness with which erasure is performed. I should have left the plaque unpolished, but I did not, and now every polished letter feels like a summons I cannot refuse. They call margins the quiet parts of books, the thin places where readers feel free to be petty, to mark ownership with a dab of ink or a penciled date. And when I find a margin note that smells like ash, it feels like discovering a small betrayal. The scrap is no larger than my thumb. The hand that wrote it is cramped and old as if candlelight had been its constant tutor. Someone has circled a date and pennied a single Latin term beneath it, TINSITUS, and then, in a smaller hand, an instruction that reads like a warning, non aperia. The paper's edge is browned, as if it had once been too near heat, and when I press it between my fingers, a fine powder falls away like the memory of burned things. I should have closed the folio and returned the scrap to whatever dark it belonged to. Instead, I do the thing archivists do when faced with a fragment. I map it. I trace cross-references. I follow marginal sigla. I set it beside my ledger and imagine that making a note of its existence will make it inert. That is vanity dressed as method. The coordinates lead me to a stamped folder in the vault marked transferred. Do not open, a label so blunt that it reads as a chastisement. Breaking a seal is a small ceremonial rupture. The sound is a thin, decisive crack, like a syllable misplaced in prayer. When the folder opens, the air that rises is not the dry smell of paper, but the intimate tang of smoke and iron, as though the pages had been folded in the lap of some burned room. Inside there is one page, folded thrice and browned at one corner, a private note rather than a formal entry. The script is hurried and almost apologetic. It reads like someone taking down what must not be spoken. The writing names places I recognize and a handful of dates with asterisks. Beside each asterisk someone has scratched a terse verb, redire, remitter, vacare, as if the verbs themselves are instruments. There is an odd economy to the unit's cruelty. Names feed entries and entries authorize motion. Here the margins are side functions as both annotation and invocation. The men I work with have learned to speak of procedural mercy with a devotion that would incline me to pity if the phrase did not always precede an erasure. They polish brass plaques and file transfer requests with a tenderness that makes the acts domestic rather than monstrous, and their language smooths over the human element as if mercy were something tidy that can be rubber-stamped. The margin note sits at the hinge where such administrative tenderness meets a ritual I cannot name. Read in the right hour, the aside pushes beyond description and becomes a directive in the world. It is, in the most literal sense, a precedent given breath. I take the page back to my desk, because documentation feels like a duty and duty feels like armor. I copy the lines into my own notes, thinking that transcription will neutralize the danger. Yet copying the note becomes a kind of collaboration rather than containment. The Latin reads into my hand, and its cadence nestles into my script like a small parasite. After that night, small coincidences begin to arrange themselves into a pattern with the ledger's neat cruelty. A mass reading shifts to emphasize a particular psalm mentioned in the margin. The sacristan arranges an odd number of candles. A clerk who has been absent returns on the precise date the note circled. I track the coincidences the way I used to map clerical errors, believing that charting will reveal the mechanism and that the mechanism can be dismantled. It is an optimism the ledger will not reward. The registrar handles the scrap with a face that registers no surprise. In this unit, surprise is a bureaucratic mistake, and our office is painfully allergic to mistakes. He smooths the paper as if calming an animal and says, "Marginalia is older than policy." His voice is ordinary and respectful, and it turns the scrap into something older than both of us. He tells me margins are where precedent gathers, and that sometimes precedent must be tended. He speaks in a way that makes stewardship sound like kindness and questions sound like imprudence. When I press him, he sighs and speaks of an older manual folded into the archives, a set of tacit rules nobody prints because printing would make them accountable. History chooses, he says, and I realize the phrase is meant to close conversation. It is a velvet padlock. I try small resistances that feel like proper procedure. I wrap the scrap in linen and place it on the altar for the night. I record its contents in triplicate and slide a duplicate into a different file. I lock the original in a drawer and chain the drawer to the vault. Redundancy comforts me. The act of creating copies is something my training taught me as a safeguard. The ledger replies with administrative patience. A docket appears the next morning bearing a transfer request I did not file. A name is quietly scrubbed from a brass plate during the midnight polishing. A parish registers a vacatio, and then reports a man absent as if he had been struck from a roll. The mechanism hides under ordinary language. Vacatio, remissio, executio terms that sound dull in clerks' mouths but function like keys. There are nights I wake tasting ash and certificate glue, convinced that thinking of the margin is the same as burning a page. I dream of hands sliding folios back into place and names unthreading themselves like poorly knotted string. In the morning, the chapel's candle wax seems less like devotion and more like residue, and the smell of burning paper moves along corridors as if a page has been opened somewhere and will not stop being read. I tell myself I will stop, that I will put the scrap back and let dust have its privacy. I repeat the rule like a rosary, non-ledger, non-recensor, but the rule is porous and language finds the cracks. A small notation becomes precedent, precedent becomes permission, permission becomes action. I should have stopped when my thumb brushed the scrap and felt heat. I should have let the folio sit sealed with its margins intact. Instead, I smoothed the fold and copied the words and kept a duplicate in my desk, as if duplication were protection. Now the ash is not only on paper, it is in my pockets, in the ledger's seams, in the rhythm of our prayers. The unit's syllogism is clear and terrible. A notation writes a precedent. A precedent permits ritual. Ritual affects removal. I keep counting the cross-references and drawing arrows between dates in the hope that mapping will make me safe, and I keep failing. I keep counting margins as if they were my own breaths. I should have crumpled the scrap and walked away, but I smoothed it instead, and now the ash is settling into the corners of everything I keep. The choir practices in the chapel when the rest of the house has gone soft. Their voices press against the stone until sound settles into the seams. I come down to listen, because habit taught me that churches preserve patterns the way attics preserve boxes, left in corners and resonant. That night, the choir moves through familiar motets until the maestro pauses, raises his hand, and introduces a phrase none of our hymnals contain, 3 descending notes that lodge in the ear. A reasonable mind offers explanations. A regional motif, a forgotten canticle, the organist's private taste, and I repeat those possibilities to myself like a prayer against superstition. Music does not register the way ink does. A melody insinuates itself into the body and becomes rule even when it is only a tune. When the choir hits that descending line the candles along the north aisle gutter and throw up an oily flame, and the sacristan's eyes move as if counting a ledger in silence. I begin to map the motif, because mapping is the instrument of my trade. I draw staff lines and ledger columns side by side until my page resembles a cartography of the chapel's breadth. Measure numbers are matched to entries, rests to transfer dates, and the tiny pause in bar 7 falls on dates that have anomalous marginalia in the ledger. The correlation feels like a discovery, the thrill of pattern recognition that our training rewards, and I tell myself I will be the one to expose coincidence as design. I take the notes to the maestro because he is a kind man who brings bread to the sacristy and whose hands adjust a boy's collar with tenderness, and I expect his curiosity to be clinical, not complicit. He smiles and says, "Some harmonies carry older things," a phrase that both disarms and silences my questions. I want to tell him that patterns older than our propriety can be instruments of law, but the unit runs on small courtesies and loud objections attract censure. Music, when repeated enough, becomes ritual. Ritual then accrues authority, and a communal chorus translates repetition into governance. The motif behaves like a tally, 3 descending notes, a held rest, and a resolving cadence that reads like a closed ledger line. I notice which voices the melody favors, the altos with breathy edges, a tenor who leans to minor, the boys who falter when unanimity is required, and the sequence insists on chorus. That insistence matters because a collective sound binds bodies into one instrument, and the ledger's taking requires a chorus to answer for it. I try to complicate the soundscape by humming other tunes under my breath during rehearsals, thinking interference will break the pattern, but the motif floods the gaps and returns. It nests in the mind like mold, persistent and patient, and I find myself waking with fragments of the tune on my tongue. I press harder and map entire services, drawing arrows from bars to columns and annotating, where rests correspond to gaps in parish rolls, and where pickups align with clerk signatures. The more I record, the more the coincidences braid into precedent, and in our unit precedent often becomes permission. One night the motif lands over a name I know, a woman who used to cough politely through the creed in the back pew, and my hands go cold. When the choir reaches the sequence that often precedes transfers, the organist holds the pedal and the candle at her pew gutters until her outline is nearly gone. The ledger the next morning shows a faint blot where her name had been. The erasure is subtle, a tidy mark that reads in clerks' mouths like housekeeping. What terrifies me is not that the chant exists, but that it seems to do the unit's work for it. The hymn counts, and the ledger follows without clerks raising pens. The machinery of removal, observed closely, is domestic and soft. Polished brass, neat stamps, apologies and soup. Yet that domesticity is worse than violence because it normalizes erasure. I take my notes to a senior registrar who evaluates anomalies, and he reads them slowly, folds the pages, and places them under his blotter as if sheltering them from air. He says, with a gentle finality, "We honor older precedents," and I hear in that phrase both preservation and a refusal to change course. I leave with my papers and realize that documentation, the act I thought would expose the pattern, paradoxically binds me to the process I want to halt. The hymn is beautiful, and the motif is tender in places, which makes it more persuasive. Beauty wraps erasure in consolation and breeds acceptance. I should have covered my ears and walked out when the dissent first sounded, but I did not. Curiosity and a duty I had misnamed as courage kept me near. Knowledge here is not neutral. Observation is itself a force that performs work, and by knotting the correlation, I have made the count legible to myself, and therefore more real. The motif begins to haunt other rooms. A sacristan hums it while arranging vestments, a novice whistles it under his breath at the refectory, and it slips into ordinary speech as idiom. The house adapts because the sound is gentle and the work looks like care. Acceptance follows kindness, and kindness masks the tallying's cruelty. I imagine confronting the choir and demanding to know the source of the tune, but dramatic gestures are moral theatre the unit treats as administrative error. Instead, I continue to map, and the record seems to feed an apparatus I do not fully comprehend, so that ink on paper transforms pattern into precedent and precedent into motion. My ledger fills with staff lines and marginalia. The more meticulous I am, the more the mechanism seems to obey the shapes I draw. At night, I dream of the choir singing the motif with no breath at all, of a chorus of shadows performing the counting in a house that has learned to be complicit. I begin to notice small administrative adjustments after I record correlations. A footnote appears where none was before. A clerk's rota shifts in a way that matches a hymn's bar, and these tiny amendments read like steering. Once I tried to leave my notes in the vestry and walk away, believing absence could be a remedy, but someone retrieved them and slid a new docket beneath my door without comment. There is a bureaucratic patience at work here. Systems do not hurry. They wait until you have adjusted to a rhythm, and then they set the rhythm as law. The realization makes my stomach a ledger too, balanced with petty calculations. How many names have been smoothed by a hymn? How many families wake to find a register altered? I begin to hoard trivial kindnesses, as if currency, helping to mend a stole, warming a cup for the sacristan, irrational attempts to make myself less disposable to the house's machinery. And yet kindness is a poor shield when the accounting is meticulous. The ledger finds arithmetic in the softest gestures and converts mercy to movement. Still, I have covered my ears and walked into the night, but instead I wrote the melody into my ledger. And now, every time the choir descends the line, I hear my own hand signing the margin. They handed me the sealed file as if it were a penalty and not a parcel. Thick manila, twine banded with the careful economy of archival restraint, and my initials penciled in the corner in a hand that looks like mine until it does not. There is a small ritual correctness to how evidence moves through our unit. Gloves, bench, duplicate. And I tell myself I will observe every instruction because procedure is a buffer against story. The vault smells like paste and lemon oil. The lamps drape the stone with a patient light, and the wood benches hold the kind of silence that teaches you how to think in footnotes. Inside the folder are diagrams that belong to a different taxonomy, not lists of names, but inked maps of the body laid out like liturgical geography. Lines trace joints as if they were stations on a pilgrimage. Arrows point from clavicle to sternum, and marginal notes in terse Latin, orans, statio, clausura, appear like rubrics. Someone has drawn a tiny cross where a scapula meets muscle. A note reads like a rubric. 3 turns, left, then whisper. The diagrams show hands cupping candles, fingers splayed over page corners, breathlines drawn from mouth to altar, as if the act of breathing itself could be indexed. The manuals we rely on are sober. These pages are liturgical. When I follow a diagram, my hands remember with an insistence that is older than my training. We learn by watching others. Gestures accumulate in flesh and return when a page asks for them. My fingers fold the vellum at the crease described by an arrow and the small lamp on the east table gutters, as if the room itself acknowledges the motion. Small effects, nothing cinematic. Yet in a house that depends on order, small effects matter. They read a movement as precedent, and precedent here is a currency that buys action in the world. I'm not a man who believes in omens, but patterns have a cunning that smells like design. I duplicate the pages and lock one copy away. Copying feels like containment until the verbs twitch from passive description into imperative. Transcription is not neutral, it is transmission. When ink passes into my hand, the words tighten and begin to behave like instructions rather than notes, and the room answers. A chalice appears polished in a place it was not the night before. A register notes an absence where none had been recorded, and a clerk's rota shifts in a way that matches a marginal asterisk. The changes are small and domestic, and because they are small, no one thinks to sound an alarm. The unit's economy is patient. It rearranges lives without spectacle by the tidy grammar of procedure. There will be skeptics who say this is psychosomatic, an imaginative mind filling blanks where evidence is thin. But I have handled vellum long enough to know the feel of old hands and new tricks. There is a lineage to gestures in this place. You watch, you imitate, you keep the rhythm of others until your body will perform a rite without a thought. My hands remember more readily than my mind. At odd hours, when the lamps are fat with wax and the house breathes slowly, my fingers find the motions again. 3 turns, left, whisper, and perform them with a fluency that will not be denied. I hum an abbreviated antiphon under my breath, and the vault exhales. The soft metallic click of a seal somewhere in the archive answers me back. I tell myself that if I document the sequence, I will demystify it, that cataloguing emotion is a way of unmaking its power. So I do what archivists do: duplicate, annotate, file. I transcribe the rubrics into my ledger, mapping arrows to folios, and the act of writing turns the page from curious artifact into instrument. Documentation, which has always felt like armor, turns out to have seams. The ledger of my notes joins the unit's ledger, and like a ledger, it counts. Small synchronicities follow. A docket slid under a door the day after I handle the file, a chalice found polished where none should be, an altar server who cannot explain why he was absent on a listed date. Each incident is administratively plausible. Each moves the same way the pages direct. There is a bureaucratic cruelty to it. No thunder, no spectacle, only receipts and neat stamps. Yet the cruelty is effective because it is respectable. I think of burning the folder. Fire feels honest and decisive when bureaucracy is a soft predator. For a moment I hold a match in the sacristy, picturing the vellum curling into an honest ash that would not be misread. Then I imagine reports written in cold ink, unauthorized destruction, breach of evidence, and the unit weighing my zeal against process. So I do the less dramatic thing. I duplicate more thoroughly. I seal copies in multiple drawers. I sign my initials in the margins as witness. The ledger replies with patience. A footnote appears, a clerk's timetable shifts, a registry finds a vacancy where there had been none. The apparatus works through tiny adjustments because tiny adjustments attract no attention. I should have stopped when my hand first found the fold and the lamp dimmed. I should have set the file back under twine and walked away with the neatness of ignorance. Instead, I catalogue what I performed and file the very gestures that now bind me. Date, folio number, a short note, handled, observed, and in the margin my own shorthand that feels like an apology. The more I write, the more the motions entangle into my days. There will be a point when the chapel's hum will seem less like settling stone and more like a chorus of names aligning to some score I helped transcribe. I do not know whether I opened a mistake or was meant to remember. The difference comforts me only insofar as comfort is a habit. In the morning, the folder is resealed by hands that did not disturb it in the night and slid back into place with the same tidy twine. The correction reads like mercy and also like a verdict. My hands have rehearsed a ritual now and will not forget it. I do what archivists do. I document the documentation, copy the copies, make a ledger of the ledger. It feels like armor until I realize the armor has seams. The unit's machinery converts tenderness into process. Each gentle handling of a name becomes a stroke of erasure elsewhere. I am part clerk now, part witness, and the difference between the two is a matter of whether I keep my hand clean. I do not. The consequences are quieter than any scream. A clerk rearranges a rota so a man is absent on the date the margins circled. A sacristan finds a taper blackened at the base, though it was never attended. A register lists a vacancy no one comments on. These are administrative cleanings, small and effective, and because they are small no one files a protest. I begin to see patterns in the domestic details. A docket slid under a door the morning after I handle the file. A candle on the north aisle set oddly. A registrar who answers questions as if he already knows the replies. The house smooths itself at the edges with the neatness of people who have practiced erasure for years, and the pain of that ordinariness is worse than any shout. I continue to rehearse the liturgy in private, counting motions until my mind goes numb. Hopping rehearsal will make the forgetting possible, though I know it is only a new kind of remembering and inevitable. I would have closed the folder and walked away, but instead I learned the liturgy by touch, and now my hands will not let me pretend I am innocent without rehearsal. I notice it first as a small mistake. The altar calendar, a modest board of paper slips hung behind the tabernacle, lists saints and memorials in a tidy procession, but one slip reads a date that seems not to belong to the past. I assume clerical error. The hand that pins the slips is not infallible, and I tell myself training makes me see patterns even where there are none. That is the comfort of archivists. We prefer error to mystery because error can be corrected. By the next service, the slip has moved an inch along its pin, and the date has changed to a day I know has not yet come. Detail is the archivist's currency. Surprise is its opposite. I begin to chart the shifts with chalk in the vestry, because mapping is the honest work I know. Each alteration is a tiny event. A feast folds backward, a memorial slips from past tense into future, a day that had seemed settled slides toward an hour. My ledger collects these changes: date, folio, reference, the slip's original position, and the chalk builds a web of arrows across the table. I tell myself that if I can discern a sequence, I can predict it. Prediction feels like agency against a house that likes to keep its opacities tidy. The correlations are domestic in their cruelty. A reversal on the board is followed within days by a ledger entry that softens a name, an obituary that unfurrows into omission. I record the instances the way I record marginalia, precise, clinical. Slowly, the clusters form. Slips that move fastest group around a compass point on my grid, as if someone had set teeth on a clock and let them bite unevenly. The pattern moves toward an hour. I begin to mark in red chalk, and the red makes my ledger resemble a dial whose hand trembles toward midnight. Others dismiss my worry in the institutional tone that removes culpability. They call it settlement, paper fatigue, or old quirks, and recommend rest as if absence were a cure. A senior registrar suggests a short pilgrimage and smiles with the bored kindness of men who arrange calendars for a living. But absence is no shelter. A transfer can be executed on paper regardless of a man's whereabouts. During a brief leave I watch, from a distance, as a name in my parish roll is picked out in a tidy column, marked with a rubric, and then listed as vacant. The form arrives as if the absence had been planned weeks before. That morning my ledger contains a neat line in a hand that is not mine. MAINTANED, PICDNTS. I begin to suspect the house rehearses its judgments. Instead of one final hour of reckoning, there is a present tense that can be nudged and polished until it reaches the precise moment some mechanism prefers. The thought sickens me because it reduces apocalypse to ordinance. No trumpets, only dockets and habit. The house does not need spectacle. It needs clerks who will sign without reading, hands that will replace slips at dusk, a choir that can learn a motif until it becomes law. That ordinariness is more efficient and therefore more terrifying. I attempt a small sabotage. One evening I remove a slip from the board and tuck it into my coat, intending absence to fracture the sequence. There is a satisfying silence the first night. I permit myself the foolish thought that I have helped. At dawn the slip is back in its place, as if a patient hand has corrected my misalignment. There is no sign of who returned it. On my ledger, not long after, a marginal note appears in a hand I do not recognize. Precedent, MAINTAINED. The note is not accusatory, its tone is administrative, yet it reads like a verdict. Noise thins into measure. Ordinary sounds take on tallying functions. The bell's pause between tolls becomes a metronome, a kettle's hiss an intake of breath, the hinges squeak a winding. I map these noises against my chalk grid and the ledger's columns, and the correlation makes my head swim. The house counts, and my life feels like an item on its balance sheet. Nights are the worst. With a lamp and a ledger I sit in the vestry watching slips move, as if they were animals packing a tank. The act of watching becomes complicity, for the thing that is witnessed accrues weight by being observed. There are moments when the arithmetic of the place feels perversely humane. A clerk delays a transfer so a widow may settle affairs. The registrar permits a small postponement to honor a funeral. Those small mercies are real and make the machinery deceptive. Kindness becomes part of the mechanism, an input that softens edges before removal. The ledger converts benevolence into timing. Tenderness becomes a variable in an equation that erases names. The domestic softness with which erasure is practiced is the most efficient and therefore the deadliest camouflage. Guilt is a ledger of its own. I imagine that removing myself would halt the machine. Then I remember the neat note on my ledger and the registrar's dry smile. The house continues regardless of any single conscience. That realization is almost worse than the pattern. Design implies origin and endurance beyond me. If the altar's calendar can be wound toward an hour, someone or something chooses that hour. The thought hollows out my stomach. I try one final experiment. I pin a fresh slip to the board with no date, an attempt at randomness. For a day the board is inert, and I feel a brittle relief. At dusk, the slip bears a tiny date written in careful script, an hour I dread, and a clerk I do not recognize walks past the vestry with a sack and does not look my way. The world continues as if nothing has occurred, and yet everything inside me knows better. The house's ordinariness remains intact even as it tightens its measure around those it names. Nights hollow out, and the chapel's stone grows colder in my bones. Chalk dust lodges in the ridges of my fingertips and brightens the seams of my shirt sleeve. Colleagues ask if I am well. I answer with clerical politeness, and they return to their tasks. When I try to tell one of them about the slips, he shrugs and speaks of humidity and paper fatigue, as if comfort will dissolve the thing I chart. I begin to dread the small domestic signs. A kettle left to whistle a second longer, a bell that lingers half a beat, a registrar pausing over the docket with an expression that looks like appetite. These are not dramatic omens, but instruments, ordinary sounds tuned until they perform a function. My ledger grows heavy with arrows and circles, and the weight of counting settles into my chest, and I am watched silently. They tried to transfer my name as if it were a postal misdirection. Neat typography, a ledger reference, a destination office, and an EXECUTD stamp in the unit's precise serif. The morning docket lay on the registrar's bench like a summons. For a moment I believed in clerical error, in a tired hand misreading similar initials, but the paper smelled of the vault, lemon oil and old paste, and the edges bore the soft abrasion of long storage. Whoever filed that form wanted it to look like something the unit already owned. The look of ownership is a language I have learned to read. Tidy margins, rubricated abbreviations, and stamps that carry a finality the spoken word cannot. I carry the sheet with the hands of a man who has catalogued other people's endings and who trusts touch to certify truth. At the clerk's bench, I ask who filed the request. He pats the paper with a gesture that is part apology, part dismissal, and says, "Not me." He is polite and careful. Denial here comes with the blandness of a seal. The registrar, whom I find in an office that smells of paste and patience, accepts the form without surprise, reads the columns, and smiles a small smile designed to make discomfort feel like instruction. Authority is distributed, he tells me, as if distribution were the same as fairness. The phrase is meant to absolve. It succeeds. The form bears fingerprints that match my own. I press a gloved fingertip along the looped ridges to be certain. The pattern maps to my thumb the way a hometown map maps streets. I did not sign. The cold realization slides into me like oil. Here is the apparatus making me both subject and evidence. If a clerical hand can place my print on a document, what else can be arranged? The ink has a behavior I have not seen in ordinary reports. Small blots creep along margins, spreading into faint veins, as if the paper were breathing and searching for seams to bind. When paper moves like that, it becomes instrument, not record. Denial is practiced here as craft. Men smooth disorder away with the same tenderness they use on brass plaques. They polish facts until they gleam and obey. They do not need to lie loudly. They let documents perform the dishonesty and keep their hands clean. I stand with my evidence and meet the unit's gentleness. Polite faces, soft tones, the quiet circulation of papers that renders cruelty respectable. One clerk produces a duplicate that claims I lodged a protest. Another presents a sheet that records my consent. Both are true in ink. My voice becomes a footnote. I mount small resistances that feel like devotion. I staple copies to doors, slide duplicates beneath blotters, and leave marginal notes like petitions. The House answers these acts with institutional indifference. Duplicates vanish or are refiled under unrelated references. The registrar calls them unattached correspondence. I begin to suspect the unit does not merely process transfers. It anticipates them, composes them, and then presents them as if fate had ordered the motion. That suspicion corrodes the idea of mistake and replaces it with the idea of design. In a fit of rage, I tear the form into strips and scatter them across the chapel floor, imagining that fire would be a remedy so honest it could not be refiled. The shreds curl at the edges like wounded leaves. Later someone gathers them into a neat pile by the sacrarium and slides them into a new file stamped reconstituted. The sight steadies my stomach into an unease that is worse than panic. The machine is patient enough to recompose what human hands destroy. Destruction is readable. The unit prefers repair because repair reads like order. Small erasures begin to orbit my life. A letter to an old friend returns sealed and stamped as if the address were vacated. A subscription I have kept for years is cancelled effective the date the ledger lists a vacancy. The telephone number I have used for a lifetime rings only to deliver an automatic disconnect message. There is a peculiar loneliness to administrative erasure because it leaves no wake, no outcry. Only a tidy line in a register and the soft shrug of men who arrange the world into columns. When I confront a registrar, he answers with a practiced softness, as if compassion can be an administrative posture that removes responsibility. I file a formal complaint. The office acknowledges receipt and sends me a notice that bears my signature and the date of an appointment I never attended. The unit excels at turning resistance into record. My protests are recorded and then used to validate histories I did not write. I appear in the ledger as both objector and consenter. Contradiction itself is preserved as doctrine. The cruelty is not a spectacle, but a legerdemain of administration. Dissent is converted into proof of compliance. At night I sit with the ledger and write my name until the letters blur. A surgeon-hopping repetition will make an incision honest. I whisper the rule, non-ledger, non-recensor, because recitation is one small locus of control left to me. Saying it steadies me for a breath, but mourning brings new stamps and an added footnote. The paper is patient. The unit is patient. Process has hours long enough for its appetite. I escalate. I gather colleagues who might take me seriously and present my copies. Some avert their eyes. Others fold their hands and speak about precedent as if precedent were law rather than habit. A senior registrar listens and says, "We maintain continuity." To him, continuity is safety. To me, it reads like a conveyor belt whose polite hands move souls as easily as ledgers. There is no single villain in his sentence, only an apparatus whose distributed authority resists interruption. If power is diffuse, accountability dissolves. People whisper about those who have the power to name and to move names. They use euphemisms, precedent, history, older manuals kept unprinted, and refuse plain speech. The system is opaque by design. I begin to barter small favors, soup for a rota change, a discreet errand for a look at a docket. Kindness becomes currency, scruples are smoothed with domestic gestures. I pay out courtesies, and the machinery thanks me with schedules rearranged just enough to make absences possible. Tenderness enacts erasure. There is a texture to this erasure that makes it intimate, and therefore worse. A seal sits on paper with a raised ridge like a scar. Ink congeals at margins, so that history flakes under the nail. At dawn documents lie pale and patient. In the light impressions appear that no I noticed the night before, tiny smudges, the ghost of a thumb where someone held a page as if it were a petition. These traces are tactile. I press my palm to a sheet and imagine my print returning like a memory I cannot expel. I hide copies beneath floorboards and inside hymnals, as if accumulation could outweigh a stamp. Each morning the ledger seems deeper, the records more complete, and my name now appears in columns like a decided verdict. When I saw the stamped EXECUTED, I did not run. The unit now holds the form and the proof of my objections. It can show both my protest and my consent. That is the cruelty, to be compelled into legibility and then used as the ledger's testimony. The paper will wait. The unit is patient. They tried to move my name like a ledger entry, but the ink is patient, and every stamped line reads like a sentence I did not agree to. I hold the ledger like a relic in my lap, palms slick with the residue of vellum and old prayer. The room smells of lemon oil and candle smoke. The lamps are low, and the stones seem to listen. I have repeated the rule until it is a bruise in my mouth. Non-ledger, non-recensor. But tonight the rubrics that held my fear together feel threadbare. The ledger is an object of procedure and of appetite. I tell myself aloud that speech here might be sacramental, that namming could be a form of aid, that utterance is a correction. I tell myself those things in the way clerks tell themselves arithmetic will comfort grief. Saying it feels like armor. I open the ledger in the middle where the entries press close, and the ink is dense. The names arrange themselves in columns like a manifest, and my finger finds the rows the way one finds anchors on a map. For a while the act is banal and clerical. I sound syllables into the chapel, and they fall into the air like receipts. The first name I read aloud is an old baker who used to give leftover crusts to altar boys. I say his name, and the sound seems ordinary until a chair downstairs clicks empty as if someone rose to leave. I tell myself it is coincidence. The house has old hinges and mice, but coincidence is a comfort archivists borrow when we can tolerate unease. The book takes a syllable and translates it into action. Ink that had been quiet in the margins ripples, faint annotations swell where there had been none. The ledger does not shout. It works with the efficiency of office labor. A stamp, a docket, a neat line down a column. For every name my mouth releases, a modest consequence follows. A chair emptied, a subscription cancelled, a phone line cut. Nothing dramatic, nothing public. Erasure here is administered like municipal housekeeping rather than miracle. The mechanics are domestic and therefore more effective. Tidy, polite, unquestioned. I think namming might be mercy. I tell myself that saying a thing aloud will unbind it, that confession will unhook the ledger's teeth. I am greedy for that possibility. I begin to read with liturgical cadence, measured breath between names like a psalm. The book answers not in words but in motion. Drafts in the corridor, the soft scrape of a clerk's shoe, a bell that lags a fraction. Sometimes the response is a blot, a new footnote in my own hand, or an unfamiliar marginal verb that appears as though written by a careful clerk. Transire, remitter, vacia. The ledger records me while I record it, and their mutual inscription is intimate and awful. Panic does not arrive as a roar, but as a precise administrative note, unemotional and believable. I try to stop reading and my mouth resists. The articulation catches in my throat, as if my vocal cords have been nailed to liturgy. My fingers seem to obey a rhythm not entirely my own. They find lines and hold the book open, as if a muscle remembers a gesture it learned in another life. I imagine tearing the volume, an honest combustion that cannot be stitched back into polite order. But the unit favors repair over ruin, and I picture the registrar calmly reconstituting the pages with the same patience he uses to polish brass. Destruction here would be readable. The house will repair what it can. The ledger begins to generate clauses. Margins fill with a script that looks like mine, but contains terminology I had not used. A new entry appears in a hand that seems to be mine and yet is older. Cessatio per me, cessation by me. I have not only read names, I have been recorded as the instrument of their motion. The thing I thought would be released by speech now uses my speech as authority. My tongue has become a pen for the book, and my voice has the legal weight of an affidavit. I have not manufactured this discovery. The ledger writes it into being. For a foolish moment, I imagine heroism. If Namming unbinds, then I can read every line until nothing is left to hold. I begin to run through names, breath quickening, voice tumbling. But speed proves to be a poor remedy. The ledger prefers measure. My haste produces weak echoes that return like unfinished prayers, and the responses sharpen. A lamp snuffs. A bell tolls late. A registrar pauses mid-sentence with the same patient look he gives when approving a transfer. The book is not amused by dramatics. It is delighted by sentences that look like orders. There is a terrible clarity in a ledger's grammar. If the book needs a witness to move an account, I have provided that witness with my breath. The clauses that appear in the margins are not merely notes. They read like legal seals. Speech here is not confession, but endorsement. I try to convert the realization into penance. Perhaps if I read everything, I can undo what I have authorized, but bureaucracy is not symmetrical. Permission and prohibition are not equal acts. The ledger's appetite requires human assent, and my assent has already been logged. I try small resistances. I pause midline and utter nonsense between names. I whisper apologies into the vellum. I hum an off-key hymn to throw the rhythm. The ledger is adaptive. It does not need my exact handwriting. It learns the rhythm of my speech and incorporates it. My footnotes become retroactive justifications. When I speak of mercy, the book echoes with terms that begin to look like loopholes. There is no spectacle, only the suffocating accumulation of administrative acceptances. When at last I close the ledger, it is not because I have mastered anything, but because the chapel seems to have less air. My hands are inked and shaking. The paper has left impressions like fingerprints in the palms. On the slate beside me a fresh notation appears. My own script, small and final. Ad notavi, cessatio per me. I have signed, whether I meant to or not. The nausea that follows is not dramatic. It is the dry, clean panic of someone who realizes their signature has weight. Outside, the chapel life continues. Carts, calls, the distant clack of shoes. Inside, a small machinery I helped wind is set. I imagine the ledger on the registrar's bench, my marginal note seen and accepted, precedent satisfied by the scratch of my name. I thought that reading would unbind the ledger's demand. Instead, my breath became the mechanism the book required. I freed names only to fasten another clause that bears my witness. I cannot pretend ignorance any longer. The ledger has my hand and my breath in its columns now. I thought confession would free us, but my voice is now the signature the ledger uses, and every syllable I gave has tightened the noose I cannot see.